These are the most expensive Rolex watches ever sold, so let's get right into it. Now, rather than giving you the most expensive Rolex watches ever sold at auction, the majority of them being ultimately Rolex Daytonas, I wanted to give you a category breakdown of the most expensive Rolex watches ever sold based on the different model lines to ultimately add a little bit of variety and introduce you maybe to some models that you've never seen before. So let's start with the first model, the first one being a Rolex GMT Master 2. The most expensive one ever sold was the one worn by Marlon Brando in the movie Apocalypse Now back in 1971. So this watch ended up selling at auction for $1.9 million all in, and it is a reference 1675 GMT Master 2 and ultimately broke the record for the single most expensive GMT ever sold at auction. It was really a breathtaking number, but it does make sense ultimately just because of the provenance of that watch, it coming from the actor Marlon Brando, and actually having a hand-engraved case back with his first initial and his last name actually engraved on the case back itself. Now, although this was the most expensive Rolex GMT ever sold at auction, I think that if a different variation of a Rolex GMT turned up at auction, it would ultimately break records and would break this one specifically. And that is the Rolex GMT Master 2 reference 6542 in a particular variation known as the Albino dial. This was the original reference 6542, which was the original GMT Master reference, featuring the Bakelite bezel, for example. However, it featured an extremely distinct white dial. Now, although there are varying opinions in terms of how many are out there, I've read anywhere from 3 to 5 examples of this watch are only known to be in existence and circulating to the general public. So if a watch like this, especially given how limited a quantity it ultimately is, were to turn up again at auction, I feel that it would definitely break this record just because of the original provenance, it being the original GMT Master reference, and second of all, it being arguably one of the most rare Rolex watches ever made. Now, one thing that I love about this watch is just the overall aesthetic of it. It having a white dial in contrast with that GMT Master 2 Pepsi style bezel. I absolutely love the design, and I think that the modern iteration of it, namely the Rolex GMT Master 2 Meteorite Pepsi, is the one that I feel kind of is the modern adaptation of it, although it is produced in much greater quantities overall. Now, although I believe the Albino dial 6542 would be the most expensive Rolex GMT Master 2 ever to be sold at auction if it did end up turning up, I think that the Rolex GMT by Marlon Brando still is a great placeholder given the history and given, of course, the story behind that watch. And at the end of the day, 1.95 million is not too shabby a result. Now, this next watch is an extremely rare watch and the most complicated that Rolex makes. It is the Rolex Skydweller in the reference 326959 RBR. It is a full pavé set gem set watch with a Meteorite dial. It's a watch I've never even seen myself in person, and it is one ultimately that I've only ever seen one time come up online or in a dealer chat for $1.5 million. Now, that is definitely a heavy price tag, but it is definitely warranted given the ultimate availability of this watch, which is really not much overall. It's also been popularized as it was featured on the wrist of the one and only Drake, and so for that reason alone, it has become extremely collectible, but is definitely a sought after model just due to the rarity of this watch overall. Now, you can get it either on an Oyster Flex bracelet, but the most rare example, and the one that ultimately I saw for 1.5 million, had a full gem set bracelet as well. Now, this is all done factory by Rolex, and in terms of production, I really would be hard pressed to know exactly how many they make, but I would be shocked if it was more than 2 to 3 per year. Now, although that $1.5 million price tag is definitely a hefty number, it is warranted given the fact that the Rolex only produces maybe a handful of these per year, and they really just don't trade hands all that often. So that price tag of 1.5 million very well may be a lot more in today's market. One of the rarest of the rare modern current production Rolexes, and ultimately one that I think definitely isn't to my taste or style whatsoever, but you have to appreciate simply due to the rarity and ultimately just the cool factor of this watch. It is a very good looking watch, you cannot deny it, whether you're a gem set fan or not. Next is arguably Rolex's most popular watch on the market. It is the Rolex Submariner, and arguably one of the most iconic watches of all time. The most expensive one ever sold at auction was a reference 6538 that ended up selling for just over $1 million. And there are a number of reasons why this particular version is extremely collectible, namely because it is a Submariner with what is known as an Explorer dial. And so it has those 3, 6, and 9 indices in a reference that is extremely limited in terms of quantity. But again, in terms of dial variation, this is one that you will almost never see again. And if it were to turn up at auction again, it would go for a lot more than it sold for. Now, it's important to take into context that this number was achieved back in 2018. And although we had already witnessed the Paul Newman Daytona auction for about $18 million, which I'll speak about in a little bit, it was a time previous to when auction prices and auction results in general ultimately exploded. And there's a number of reasons why. A lot of people have been speculating, is it money laundering or things of that nature? And ultimately, this is really incorrect. When you take into consideration the fact that these auction houses cater to people who are buying art pieces, for example, in the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, it's very easy for them to essentially push those clients into buying something like a watch, which is an alternative asset, for a fraction of the price that they would ultimately pay if they were buying a piece of art. And so if this watch were to resurface and would go to auction again, I would safely assume it probably would fetch upwards of $2 million at this point, just because of the rarity of this example, it being maybe a unique watch or it being a part of only a handful of watches that feature this specific dial and this specific reference. The Rolex reference 6062 is one of the most rare and collectible Rolex models ever made because simply they didn't make many of them, and it's one of the few Rolex watches that features a calendar complication. The most expensive variation of this watch sold at auction was the one owned by Vietnam's emperor by the name of Bao Dai, which reached just over $5 million. Now, the $5 million result is a shocking one considering the fact that the original family sold the watch back in 2002 for $235,000, which, to be fair, at the time was a hefty price tag also, but it's definitely a mistake in retrospect. Now, the watch itself reached such an impressive price tag given the fact that it is an extremely rare reference in a design that was only done one time in yellow gold with a black dial and diamond set hour indices, so it is therefore a piece unique from Rolex, about as rare as you can get, literally, because it is one of the rarest models Rolex has ever made historically in a variation that was only done once before. So ultimately, it definitely makes sense why it achieved that $5 million price tag, and there's no doubt that if it were to go at auction again, it definitely would fetch a lot more. The second to last watch is Rolex's flagship model, the Rolex Day-Date, and the most expensive one ever sold at auction was a rainbow Khanjar Day-Date that is extremely rare and definitely sought after, given the fact that it is one of the original rainbow reference Day-Dates and really the first of its kind in terms of this reference. Now, the watch itself is an 18059 that features a pave set dial, pave set center links on the presidential bracelet, and a rainbow colored sapphire bezel, which is ultimately one of the first of its kind ever made, especially given when this watch was produced. The result itself was a staggering $1.3 million at auction, the most expensive Day-Date ever sold, which definitely makes sense given the fact that this is one of the original rainbow watches ever produced by Rolex, and given ultimately just the rarity of a watch like this, you simply will not find probably another one for a very, very long time, be it at auction or be it on the open market. Now, this is an important note for this watch and all the other watches that I mentioned earlier, just because you simply will not find another like it, or in the condition that it was originally in, or in the variation that it was ultimately made in. All of these factors being extremely important to Rolex collectors specifically, who really look at those small idiosyncrasies and differences between different references and different watches to ultimately obtain what that value is of the watch itself. And last but not least is a watch that really needs no introduction. It is the Rolex Daytona, owned by Paul Newman, that sold at auction for $18 million. It held the record for the most expensive watch ever sold at auction, only for 2 years until it was outdone by the Patek Philippe Grandmaster Chime in a steel case and a salmon dial in a piece unique. But ultimately, this watch just can't be understated how important it is. I like to use it as a reference point for when the Rolex market and the watch market in general started to explode in popularity and in price. Never had we seen a watch achieve such an important and historic figure, especially at auction, which ultimately brought upon, in my opinion, a new market and a new watch collector, which started to really buy into watches as an alternative investment or watches as an asset, for example. Now, Paul Newman himself actually had a second Daytona that came up at auction that sold for just under 5.5 million. Now, for sure, of course, that big brother, that 2017 sale for 18 million will always stand out from the herd. That $5 million price tag is definitely impressive considering what other Daytonas have been sold for at auction, namely ones that were done in a piece unique, for example, in the arguably most collectible model line of all time in the Rolex Daytona. So what makes this watch special and why did it sell for $18 million? Well, it's a combination of factors. Ultimately, this is a 6263 in an exotic, what's known as a Paul Newman dial nowadays, simply because of that auction result. But the fact that it was also owned by Paul Newman himself is just a dead indicator for its value. Now, there's a lot of speculation in terms of who ultimately bought this watch for this price tag. I've even heard rumors that potentially it was Rolex themselves who ran up the bid on this watch and ended up buying it for the price tag of 18 million. Now, of course, it's something that we'll never know, but it's always fun to speculate about. But guys, let me know down in the comments, what is the most expensive Rolex watch ever sold that you think is ultimately the best? I would love to hear your feedback down in the comments below. Of course, let me know also what kind of videos you'd like to see in the future. And guys, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And don't forget, guys, I'll see you in the next one.